Okay, friends, we are here. Another week of stories, another week that we are um, away from you in school. And so I so miss you still. And um, I just love reading to you each week, and it makes me happy. So hopefully, these are some fun stories that you've come to enjoy over the last little bit. So, a couple of weeks ago, I read to you one of my favorite authors, which is Chris Van Allsburg. And Chris Van Allsburg has written so many good books that I'm going to introduce you to one more of his books today. This one is pretty creative, and it is called Bad Day at Riverbend. Riverbend was a quiet little town, just a couple dozen buildings alongside a dusty road that led to nowhere. Though the coach occasionally rolled through town, it never stopped because no one ever came to Riverbend and no one ever left. It was the kind of place where one day was just like all the rest. Kind of feels like what we experienced in last month. We felt like the same, every day was the same. But let me get a little closer. Sorry. There you go. But one morning, Sheriff Ned Hardy stood in front of the Riverbend jail and saw something he'd never seen before, a brilliant light in the western sky. It lasted a few minutes, then faded away. Sheriff Hardy went to the jailhouse. He was sitting quietly at his desk, wondering what that strange light meant when a loud pounding rattled the jailhouse door. The sheriff opened it and saw Owen Buck, the blacksmith's boy, breathing so hard he could barely speak. In between gasps, Ned Hardy heard the words, "Stagecoach! Something awful!" The sheriff followed Owen outside. The coach had never stopped in Riverbend before, but now it stood motionless at the end of the street. A crowd gathered around it, but they held back as if they were afraid to get too close. It was easy to see why. The horses were covered with great stripes of some kind of shiny, greasy slime. See that? Weird, huh? "What is it, Sheriff?" someone asked as Ned Hardy stepped up to the coach. He didn't know. It was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, the strangest thing anyone had ever seen. The horses were nervous and breathing hard. They looked terrible, their smooth white coats scarred with the strange stuff that hung from them in loopy ropes or stuck out like stiff wire. The sheriff grabbed a piece with both hands. It was slippery. He gave it a pull, and the horse jerked away and whined in pain. Whatever the stuff was, it was stuck to them as sure as their flesh. "Where's the coachman?" Sheriff Hardy asked. "Gone," someone answered. The coach came into the town without him. Hmm. Ned Hardy wasn't sure what to do. He scratched his head. "Well," finally said, "guess I'll go look for him." The sheriff rode out of town, following the wagon's trail west. Before long, he stopped his horse. The ground was covered with the same marks that were on the horses. Whatever happened must have happened here. He didn't see any sign of the driver, but he heard a muffled sound. What do you think all of this greasy stuff is everywhere? Ned Hardy got off his horse and discovered the coachman sitting on the ground behind a rock. The poor man looked awful, his eyes covered with the greasy slime. Thick stripes of the stuff ran right across his eyes and mouth. He couldn't see or speak except to mumble. The sheriff helped the coachman up and led him to the horse. As they rode back together back towards Riverbend, Ned Hardy heard the sound of thundering hoofbeats. He rode to the top of the ridge and looked down on a charging herd of cattle, many marked with awful slime that covered his poor saddle mate. When he turned his horse back toward town, he saw the same thing, same bright light in the sky he had seen that morning. It was just beyond the horizon, right over Riverbend. It didn't last long. As he approached Riverbend, it was clear to Ned Hardy, even from a distance, that something terrible had happened. Riding into town, he could barely bring himself to look at the buildings, now covered with the hideous marks and stripes. The sheriff got out of the saddle. The town looked deserted, but when he passed the hotel, someone called out, "Sheriff!" Ned Hardy helped the coach driver down and led him to the hotel. The townspeople and some cowboys were gathered inside. A few were covered with the greasy slime. They all told the same story. Without warning, the sky overhead filled with a brilliant light, a light that froze everything it touched. Herds of cattle, even birds in the sky, and it was blinding. Like stepping out of privy and looking straight into the sun at high noon, one of the cowboys said. Couldn't see a darn thing. When the light passed, they were covered with the greasy marks. What are we going to do, Sheriff? Someone asked. We can't spend our lives hiding in here. No, Ned Hardy said. We can't. He walked outside and stood in front of the hotel. His bravery inspired the others, and they joined him there. They looked at their poor town. Pretty little Riverbend was now too ugly for words. Look, someone shouted, pointing at the sky above the hills just out of town. The mysterious light appeared. Some people ran back inside the hotel, but Ned Hardy just stared at the strange light without blinking an eye. Whatever evil thing has done this out in those hills, he said, pointing in the direction of the light, I aim to ride out there and put an end to it. The sheriff left town with a posse of well-armed men. They followed the trail of light. It wasn't hard to tell where it had been. The greasy streaks were everywhere. The men even saw them floating in the sky. But the light they saw always appeared just beyond the horizon. Then they saw the mysterious light shine brightly just over the next hill. The men crawled up the hill, but the light faded away as they peeked over the top. Looking down, the brave cowboy saw something that made them gasp. There was a man standing perfectly still at the bottom of the hill. He was as tall as a cottonwood tree and as skinny as a broomstick. And he looked like he was made entirely of the greasy stuff that now covered the countryside. I wonder if you can guess what the greasy stuff is yet. I don't know. Ned Hardy was sure that his this long-legged fellow, was the cause of all of their grief. They had only one chance. They have to get close enough to take a shot at the skinny devil before he used the light to freeze them. They crawled back to their horses. Ned Hardy gave a silent signal, and the posse charged forward. But just as they came over the hill, They were frozen in the bright light that suddenly filled the sky. Can you see what this was? There's a hand and a crayon. So that's our greasy stuff, I think. And here is our little cow boy or girl coloring the cowboys and the sheriff. And then the light went out. So if you look at this really close, this little boy or girl was coloring in a cowboy coloring book. And so every time they would turn the page and color more, that's when the light would show up and they would add more of the greasy streaks of the crayon to each page. And it's kind of a fun idea. We like to color in our coloring books all the time, but we never have thought of it as that way, as a coloring book coming to life. Kind of like reminds me of Toy Story and things like that. So maybe you should go color today. This will inspire us all to go color. Chris Van Allsburg is very creative with his stories, and they're not like normal ones that are like anything else that we read. So that's what makes him fun. And he's the one that illustrates all of this. And in fact, this is a book. This is him on the back of the book with his little daughter. Kind of fun coloring together. I hope you have a wonderful week. I'll see you next time, Rockets.